Walter Edgar calls me when he needs a token woman to be politically correct. My husband suggests that I should remind you that I taught at the University of South Carolina. I'm wearing orange today in honor of the autumn season and Halloween, not as a tribute to Clemson. Doug finished with Walter Edgar's comment that the Revolutionary War started and ended in Charleston, but it was not won there. It was won in the back country. I'm going to talk today about militia engagements in the back country, way back. May I have the map, please? So this is Mouson's map, South Carolina, and Francis Marion, of course, was involved along here. I'm going to speak about this area up here. It's the Saluda River there and 96, the Enoree River, the Tiger River, the Pacolet, and the Broad. This is the backcountry militia I want to talk about. Now, Michael Scoggins, in his book, The Day It Rained Militia, wrote this: anyone who thinks that the Carolina militiamen were useless vagabonds who rarely fired a shot in battle would do well to spend some time reading the actual records of their service. Now, I want to talk about that, and because of Mike Scoggins writing about Huck's defeat, I will start a little bit east of the Broad River. In July 1780, Christian Huck of the British Legion, which was Tarleton's command, moved into the new acquisition. He burned Hill's Iron Works. He burned the library and home of a Presbyterian minister. He hacked to death a young Quaker boy who really posed no danger to him. And he took two young men prisoner, and they were melting down pewter to provide shot for the Patriots. And he planned on hanging them the next morning. He moved to Bratton's plantation, threatened Mrs. Bratton, trying to find out where her husband was. She had anticipated their arrival and sent a slave to Thomas Sumter's camp to warn her husband. Now, Christian Huck moved then on to Williamson Plantation, very, very close to Bratton's plantation, and spent the night there. Put the prisoners that he intended to hang the next morning in the corn crib. And early in the morning of July the 12th, the Whig militia showed up and caught Huck and his mounted in the peach orchard and killed, wounded, or scattered Huck's force. Christian Huck was killed, along with 30 to 40 of his men, and about 50 were wounded. Now, it was a significant victory for the Patriots, but it was not the only encounter on July the 12th. Now, British from 96 had moved into the backcountry, and they had arrested people that they thought were a threat. One of the men they arrested was Colonel John Thomas, Sr., who was the commander of the Spartan Regiment. Now, he was being held at 96, and in poor health, his wife went down to take care of him. And she heard some of the wives of the provincials who were at 96 talking about a raid that was planned for the next evening at Cedar Springs. Now, Mrs. Thomas knew that those were men of the Spartan Regiment, which was now commanded by her son, John Thomas Jr. She rode roughly 50 miles on horseback to warn the Spartan Regiment. Now, on the night of July the 12th, provincials under the command of Captain James Dunlap. Oh, I'm sorry. Yep, Dunlap. Remember his name because he's a villain. I'm a storyteller and I can afford to be partial. He's a villain. Anyway, he came to attack, and his men drew the swords, intending to kill the sleeping man. As they approached the firelight, they found that there were no men there. But now they, silhouetted against the fire, came under attack from the concealed patriots in the woods. Many were killed, and the rest were scattered into the night. Now, in the backcountry, we had a lot of different militias from different parts of the country. And Georgia was now a royal colony. South Carolina was pretty much conquered. And North Carolina realized they would be next. So one of their commanders, Militia Colonel Charles McDowell, decided to muster the backcountry militia and present a defense. He settled at Earl's Ford on the Pacolet River, which is up by Landrum. Now that was very convenient because he wanted militia from North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, and the Over Mountain men. That was western North Carolina at the time, but it's now eastern Tennessee. And Earl's Ford was a good place for them to come. And the first Georgians that started to move toward Earl's Ford were from Berks County, Georgia, under the command of Captain John Jones. Now, as they moved across on July the 12th, they encountered British troops at Gowan's Old Fort, and they took Gowan's Old Fort. And they took the horses, the weapons, and the boots from the British provincials and sent them hiking down the road toward 96. July the 13th in the morning, Dunlap is trying to gather up the troops that were scattered from Cedar Springs, and he now encounters some of his men who had just been routed out of Gowan's Old Fort, and he now realizes he's got Georgians to deal with. And he starts trailing the Georgians. Now they arrived at McDowell's camp late at night. McDowell had a camp of roughly 250 patriots already assembled. And the Georgians were too tired to set up a camp. They stretched out to sleep. And before dawn, Dunlap found the sleeping Georgians and attacked with swords. Killed 2 of them, and then the fight got over into McDowell's camp. More were killed, but then Dunlap realizes that he has made an error, and he's in over his head, and he departs in haste back toward Fort Prince. And he is pursued, and when the Patriots catch up, they kill 13 of the provincials and capture 35 horses. Now, the British, realizing that there are a lot of Patriot militia in the area, evacuate Fort Prince. Now, more militia arrive at McDowell's camp, and the Georgians come, commanded by Elijah Clark, my hero, commander of the Wilkes County Militia. And shortly after that, men come from over the mountains, from Nolichucky and Watauga, and under the command of Isaac Shelby. Now, some of those people may have been related because they have the same history. Many of them used to live in North Carolina and left North Carolina after the Regulators were defeated at the Battle of Alamance. So they may have been known to each other, but whether or not they were connected by family, faith, friendship, they were cut from the same cloth. They had moved into Indian territory and were prepared to defend their settlements, and they were one rough bunch. They began to campaign together, Clark and Shelby's men. Now, by now, there's only one more post in the backcountry that the British can claim, and that is Fort Anderson, which was known locally as Fort Thickety. And Shelby and Clark siege that area and take it without firing a shot on July the 30th. And they capture 200 muskets, all the supplies and ammunition, which they sorely needed. They then moved down toward Cedar Springs. And August the 8th, Captain Dunlap attacked Clark, and then Clark was joined by Shelby, and there was a huge battle along the Old Georgia Road. In that battle, Dunlap got the worst of it. A lot of his men were killed, and about 50 were taken prisoner, and Dunlap was run off. But as he retreated, he encountered his commander, who was Patrick Ferguson. And Ferguson turned him around, and in the afternoon, Ferguson and Dunlap attacked Clark and Shelby again. And in the running battle, where the Patriots would stop and fight, then move on and stop and fight again, the Patriots were able to keep those 50 provincial prisoners, and they eventually were moved over into Nolichucky and kept there for the rest of the war. When the Patriots reached the high ground, Ferguson broke off the pursuit and left. And in this encounter, in addition to the 50 prisoners, 30 provincials had been killed. Now, this is the first time that Clark and Shelby will thwart Patrick Ferguson, but it will not be the last. Now, Major Patrick Ferguson was the inspector of militia, and his job was to recruit Tory militia, and Cornwallis expected him to control the rebels in the backcountry. But Cornwallis was in Camden, and he wanted Ferguson to protect his western flank. So Ferguson had moved a little closer to Camden. His headquarters had been in 96. Now, you need to control the river crossings, and you need a source for food. And Musgrove's Mill provided both. And a small group of loyalist militia were holding Musgrove's Mill, controlling 3 forts and a mill. And McDowell decided to attack Musgrove's Mill. It was defended by fewer than 200 loyalists under the command of Clary and David Fanning. And Clark and Shelby prepared to move. Before they left camp, they were joined by another group of militia, James Williams and the Little River Militia. Now, he had some people with him who were not Little River Militia people, but all of them had left Thomas Sumter's camp. Now, William Hill, a friend of Thomas Sumter, wrote a scathing account of Williamson and these men, accused them of stealing supplies and men from Sumter, and really accused them of treason. But if you think about Williams, he was a man of tremendous experience. He had been in the Snow Campaign. He had been at Alligator Creek and Briar Creek and Stono, and was very well respected. His home was in Little River, and that was 15 miles from 96. Ferguson had taken his home, had moved the Williams family into outbuildings, and they were literally under house arrest. And when Williams was with Sumter, Sumter's focus was on troops that were stationed in Camden. And the Little River Militia family and property were threatened by soldiers from 96. So they were very, very eager to join Clark and Shelby and go to Musgrove's Mill. And they set out at night, arrived at the site early in the morning, expecting to attack by surprise, but a Tory patrol detected them, so the element of surprise is gone. And then they learn that a group of men, provincials from 96, were moving across the area to join Ferguson farther east and had stopped at Musgrove's Mill. So now the Patriots are tremendously outnumbered by not only the Loyalist militia that's there, but provincials. Seasoned, experienced, disciplined, well-trained provincials from 96. Now, their horses are too tired for the Patriots to withdraw. They will have to fight. And according to the records, they set up a breastwork on a ridge about 2 miles north of the Enoree River, overlooking a cleared field. They sent a group under a Wilkes County captain by the name of Shadrach Inman to attack the British and entice them out into the battle. And it worked, and the British finally came out and formed in that field. Now, the fighting was extremely hot and heavy, and every British officer and Loyalist officer was killed or wounded except one. Now, when Colonel Ennis, who was commanding the British, was shot from his horse with a bullet through his neck, the British turned and ran. They rushed to the river and beyond, and the Patriots poured lead into the retreating British. Now, the British crossed the river and kept on going. The Patriots stopped to get their horses brought up because they had been tethered well behind the battle line. And while they were there, a message arrived from McDowell that Gates had been defeated at the Battle of Camden. And they needed to get back to their homes, back to safety, before they were cut off. Now, before they departed, Williams, Shelby, and Clark made a pact. They agreed that massing the militia the way they had was an effective way of dealing with the British. So they would keep in touch, and if one were threatened, they would all come. And with that, they left the battlefield. On that battlefield, 63 British were killed, 90 wounded, and the Patriots had 70 more prisoners, provincials and Loyalists alike. The Patriots suffered 4 killed. One of them, sadly, was Shadrach Inman of Georgia. Now, shortly after the Patriots left the battlefield, troops from Ferguson's command arrived, and seeing what had happened, they started a chase, but their horses gave out and they had to quit, and so they would return. It was a splendid victory. However, it was necessary for them all to leave. Clark went back to Georgia. Now, Clark had a thing about Augusta, and it was commanded by Lieutenant Colonel Thomas Brown of the King's Rangers. Now, early in the war, Brown had been in Augusta. He was one of the local Loyalists, very obnoxious, and the Sons of Liberty had taken him prisoner, treated him very badly, whipped him, and then tarred and feathered him. And the tar, being a little hot, burned off 2 of his toes, so he was referred to as Burnfoot Brown. Now, he did not much like the Georgia militia. Not only did he have very well-trained provincial troops, but he also had Indian allies that were threatening the backcountry. So Clark decided to attack. Now, he didn't have nearly the number of militia that he hoped. James McCall came from South Carolina and some other South Carolina troops, but he attacked anyway. Now, I'm going to give you a very brief account of this battle. If you want an in-depth understanding of the battle, Steve Rauch, who's sitting right over there, is the authority on the battles in Augusta. And I hope he doesn't have to correct me. The first things went very well. Clark dispersed the Indians, then took Fort Grierson, captured the cannon, and Brown hunkered down at McKay's trading post. And after a very successful siege, when it appeared that nothing could save Brown, reinforcements arrived from 96 under the command of John Kruger. They came in such a hurry that Clark, in his retreat, left his wounded behind and some of his men taken prisoner. Now, Brown had been wounded, confined to indoors. He had 13 of Elijah Clark's men hanged indoors in the staircase so he could watch them die. Many of the wounded were turned over to the Indians to be tortured and killed. And then Lieutenant Colonel Tom Waters and his white savages, Kruger and then Brown's men moved into the area known as Wilkes County. 100 homes were burned, Indians attacked, families were taken, women and children killed or taken into captivity, and just terrible atrocities. And Clark called to muster his militia at Petersburg, which is, was on the Savannah River north of Augusta. 300 men responded to the call, accompanied by 450 women and children. They dared not leave the civilians behind. What were you going to do with all of those civilians? And Clark knew that the only place that they would be safe would be over the mountains in Nolichucky or Watauga, because the British had not been able to breach the mountains. He had no choice. It was 200 miles. It would take a couple of weeks. He had rations for maybe 4 or 5 days. Some would have to walk. He didn't have enough horses. But he left and went north along the Savannah River and crossed where, at the confluence of the Savannah and Tugelo, which is roughly where 85 crosses the state line today, and puts him in northwestern South Carolina. And he was headed into the mountains of North Carolina and into what is now eastern Tennessee. Now, Kruger reported to Lord Cornwallis that Clark was on the move toward Shelby. And Cornwallis sent Patrick Ferguson out to the west to intercept Clark. Now, Ferguson pushed the North Carolina militia clear to the old fort, which is west of where Marion, North Carolina is today, and he could not find Clark. So he sent an ultimatum across the mountains to Shelby. And you've all heard about the ultimatum. Come lay down your weapons, pledge your allegiance to the king, or I will go over there, hang you, and lay waste your settlements with fire and sword. Now remember, Shelby was one of those people who envisioned a militia army, and he called out the militia. First met at Sycamore Shoals, and then they would take the battle to Ferguson. They would not let him come to them. And as they moved across down through the mountains, Shelby was joined by militia from Virginia and North Carolina, South Carolina, Williams showed up, and remember, he was part of the three that had made this pact. But where was Clark? Clark was lost. With all of this group of over 700, he was lost between Mount Pisgah and Mount Mitchell, which would put him roughly where Asheville is today. But fortunately, a group of militia moving to join Shelby under the command of Edward Hampton found Clark with his half-starved and exhausted troops and civilians, and Clark had no way of knowing how to get through the mountains. When Clark found out about what had happened, he must have been conflicted. After all, he had promised to respond to this kind of threat, but he had all these civilians to take care of. He sent 30 Georgians under the command of Major William Candler and Captain Stephen Johnson, and he sent Peter Strozier and Patty Carr with them, two of the meanest Georgians alive. So he sent a very elite group to join Shelby. And Hampton's men showed him how to get through the mountains at Sam's Gap. And those of you who have traveled north of Asheville on the extension of I-26 have seen the sign for Sam's Gap at the top of that mountain at the border of North Carolina and Tennessee. And that took Clark and his people into the Nolichucky River Valley. And the people of Tennessee, or the Overmountain people, kept the Georgians there till the danger of war had passed. They had to have been there over more than 2 years. Now the men who went with Hampton joined Williams at Kings Mountain and fought under Williams. Now I'm not going to go into the Battle of Kings Mountain because the next presenters are going to cover that. And I'm sure that you will hear all about Ferguson's campaign. I do wonder about their title, The Life, Genius, and Legacy of Patrick Ferguson. I'm concerned about the genius designation because by my calculation, at the time of Kings Mountain, Clark and Shelby had seriously inflicted damage on the area that Ferguson was supposed to have secure. They'd killed 17 of Dunlap's men at Earl's Fort, killed 30 and took 50 prisoners in Cedar Springs and Wofford's Iron Works, killed 63, wounded 90, and took 70 prisoners at Musgrove's Mill. Now, Ferguson was being pursued by Shelby, and he had no idea where Clark was. I think it would have been prudent for him to have had more respect for the Patriot militia. Now, Ferguson was killed, of course, and so was James Williams at Kings Mountain. Walter Edgar writes, each of the engagements played a role in leading to the decisive battle at Kings Mountain. Without the partisan victories at Huck's Defeat, Stallion's, Cedar Springs, Gowan's Old Fort, Earl's Fort, Prince's Fort, Thickety Fort, Hanging Rock, and Musgrove's Mill, there would have been no battle at Kings Mountain. Cornwallis would have been able to march unchallenged into North Carolina. Well, at the time of Kings Mountain, Cornwallis was at Charlotte Courthouse. He moved back to Winnsboro, which I think is a retreat. He went into winter camp, hoping for rest and relaxation, but the Patriot militia was not prepared to quit. Clark, spending 3 weeks in the Nolichucky, getting his people settled, then returned to South Carolina and joined Thomas Sumter. Thomas Sumter was campaigning between the Tiger and the Enoree Rivers, right close to Musgrove's Mill. Musgrove's Mill is 30 miles from 96. Cornwallis sent Tarleton to destroy Sumter. Now, Tarleton had just returned to Cornwallis's camp because he'd been over here chasing Francis Marion through the swamps. Well, that wasn't successful, so now he's going to go after Sumter. And he attacked Sumter at Blackstock's farm on the edge of the Tiger River. And in doing so, lost 97 of his men, men from the British Legion and the 71st Highlanders, which was a terrible loss for him. Anyway, he withdrew. He was going to regroup and bring up his artillery and a few more things the next day. But Thomas Sumter had been seriously wounded. And overnight, the Patriots crossed the Tiger River and disappeared. Now, Clark moved close to the Georgia border, and on the 13th of December, he was attacked and overrun by troops from 96. Now, in that encounter, 8 Georgians were killed. Elijah Clark took a chest wound, a shot to the chest, and James McCall, who was with him, was also wounded. But the men were able to get them off the battlefield. Now, a wound like that would have killed most people, the British thought, and they assumed that they had killed Elijah Clark. So the large group of them went back to 96, and they left a small detachment to mop up the operation under the command of who else but James Dunlap. When Dunlap found out that Clark was not dead, he was determined to find him and kill him. And James McCall's property was close to the battlefield, and so he went there to find them. They were not there, but Dunlap's troops brutalized that family, threatened